Sneed here has published 50 books.
Almost 100.
Almost 100. So I just cut that in half. The variety of careers and experiences, but lately picture books and illustration.
Yeah, and I'm doing a lot of adult writing these days.
Yeah, that's another thing I've heard. But you have a fantastic presentation for people of all ages, and I actually found that border crossings had a lot of value as a adult, and it does not condescend, but it is very clear in its explanations of what's happening at the border. And so you have a pictorial presentation.
I do.
Of your experiences in just exploring the environment and learning about what is happening down there with the crossings, along with some other books that you brought along. So if you don't mind, please take us on that journey.
I will be delighted to do that. I'm wondering, could we get this one lowered as well?
Here,
just the second one in.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. And here I'll let me get the mic going. All right. Ooh, oh, can you hear me all right? Okay. Did I deafen you there? Oh, okay. Yeah, I've got hearing aids too. I've got to adjust them all the time. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. It's been, I think, 5 years since I spoke at the Festival of the Book, and that's okay. And we should be sure to thank Sam for doing so much to put this festival together too. It's just amazing. All of these, yay! All of the, hundreds of hours to put this event on, and I'm just really honored to be here with all of you, be able to talk to you. If you're at all familiar with me and my work, you'll know that I've spent most of my career writing about science and nature and the environment. And today I'd like to share with you parts of my journey, and especially focus on a couple of my newer books that I have very strong feelings about. But as far as how I became a writer, it was pretty simple, actually, how I got interested in nature and science. That's because of my parents. I had two parents who were both biologists. My mom was a lifelong high school science teacher with a particular passion for marine mammals that she shared with me when I was growing up. My dad, meanwhile, was a professor at the University of West Florida in Pensacola. And during my long summers with him, we would explore everywhere looking for critters, basically, especially reptiles. Every time it rained, we'd jump in my dad's beat-up old pickup truck because turtles would climb up onto the roadways, and we didn't want them to get run over. So we'd go around rescuing turtles. And by the end of my second summer in Florida, we had more than 50 turtles in the backyard. We had so many, I bought orange paint and numbered their shells so I could tell them apart. And then the next year, we went out and let them all go in a place that we thought would be healthy and happy for them. Because of this, I had a big, strong love of nature, but when I was 15, something else would happen that would elevate my interest in the natural world, and that is my mother and stepfather took me to Asia. And this was the very first time I'd been out of the country, and I was just blown away from the moment we landed in Hong Kong. The food was different, the language was different, but of course the nature was a lot different too. From there, we flew to Malaysia, where I saw my very first tropical rainforest. Then we went to Bali and Thailand and Singapore. And I was so amazed by everything that I saw that I began keeping a journal. In fact, this is my very first journal entry I ever made. And I often trace my writing career to this first journal entry that I made here, even though I didn't think I was going to become a writer. Back when I went to college, I didn't hesitate to study marine biology. And it wasn't until after I graduated that I began to write. It took me about 8 or 9 years to sell my very first book, a children's nonfiction book called Sea Snakes. And from there, I began a pattern which has served me very well. I realized, even with the publication of Sea Snakes, that I wasn't content to just do library research for my books. So I began kind of a pattern of going to places and learning about science there and then writing about it. So in 1994, I spent 2 months at a place called the Monteverde Cloud Forest in Costa Rica. I went climbing trees with scientists and we went out bat netting. After that, I went to Australia's Great Barrier Reef, where I went scuba diving with scientists, especially some who were looking at this event called the coral mass spawning event, which is one of the most amazing things that happens on our planet. My most exciting thing, which was kind of interesting in view of the recent Titanic disaster, was being able to go diving in a deep sea submersible with scientists to learn about bioluminescent animals, animals that make their own light. And as you can imagine, all of these adventures have turned into a great variety of books, including older science books and middle grade science books like In the Deep Sea. But what I'm probably best known for in my career are the picture books, actually, the simplest books that I write, like The Forest and the Clouds or One Night in the Coral Sea, books like Wings and Teeth. And Sneed B colored the third's most fun book ever about lizards, which I guarantee you is the only humorous lizard book you're probably ever going to read. But the last 10 years, well, like most writers, my career has definitely gone through different transitions and different phases. But in the last 10 years, it has especially revolved around birds. Now, I've always liked birds growing up. By the way, are there any birders in here among you? Are you a birder also? Kinda, sort of. Oh, that's perfect. That's perfect. So, and I always liked birds, but I never really had anyone take the time to teach me about them. I did write a few books earlier on in my career about birds, including Beaks, which is probably my best-selling book I've ever written, Birds of Prey, and that inspired an adventure young adult thriller called Flashpoint. But it wasn't until I began working on this book, Firebirds, Valuing Natural Wildfires and Burned Forests, that I really took the deep plunge into birds. And how did this happen? Well, when I write a book like this, if I can, I try to take most of the photographs for it. That way I don't have to split the royalty with an artist, right? Or a photographer or something. And so I was going out into the burned forest, often with my son Braden, who's over here, and his good friend Nick Ramsey. And even at the age of 11 or 12, Nick was already an accomplished birder. And so we'd go out and we'd look for birds. Nick would help us identify them. I'd take photographs of them. And we just started slowly learning about the birds around Missoula. But then my wife Amy, who's sitting right there, the following Thanksgiving, rented us a movie called The Big Year. Has anyone ever seen this movie? It's hilarious. Go rent it. It's about these three avid birders who are trying to set the world record for how many birds they can see and count in a calendar year in the US and Canada. And the big year really is a thing. And after the movie was over, my son Braden looked at me and said, "Daddy, we should do a big year." I thought, oh, okay. And so we went out the next year and we looked for birds. And I think we got about 120 species that year. We didn't know if that was a lot or not so many. But the following year, we kept learning more and more about birds until near the end of 2015, we looked at each other and said, you know, we should do a more serious big year next year. And that's what we did. We began our big year on the coldest day of the year in Montana, January 2nd. I think it was about minus 20 degrees when we went out looking for birds. It was so cold that the birds were turning blue. But nonetheless, we saw about 20, 25 birds that day and kept birding hard through January and February. So by the end of February, we had about 50 species, but we had set a goal for ourselves of about 250 birds for the year. And we weren't too worried yet because we were about to go on our first of 2 big out-of-state trips I had planned for the year. The first one to Arizona. Now, how many of you have been to Arizona before? Okay, almost everyone. Well, if you've ever looked at the birds, you'll know they're a lot different from what we have up here. Immediately, we were seeing things like cactus wrens and curve-billed thrashers. We were seeing vermilion flycatchers, and even behind a gas station in Tucson, we saw a roadrunner, you know, and it was great. We came back from the trip with about 120 species, and we thought, gosh, you know, it's still early in the year. Maybe we should up our target to 300 species for the year. So we did. And again, we were optimistic because a couple of weeks later, we went to Texas, which also had all of these amazing different kinds of birds, like scissor-tailed flycatchers. We had American avocets. We also have those in Montana, by the way, but only in summer. And we especially went to a place called High Island. Why? Because every year at High Island, migrating birds come in by the hundreds of thousands to this area. Why? Because they have just flown over the Gulf of Mexico. They're exhausted, they're hungry, and they land, a lot of them, in the first place they come to. And for many of them, that's High Island. So we immediately started seeing things like prothonotary warblers and black-throated green warblers, summer tanagers, and they had a rookery there for wading birds like roseate spoonbills there. And we got a ton of birds, even though our last day got rained out by one of Texas's annual 100-year floods that they have down there, right? And so we came back from Texas with about 220 species of birds for the year. We thought, maybe we've still set our sights too low. Let's raise it to 350 for the year, okay? Again, we were optimistic because we got back to Montana and breeding season was coming on. We were getting, you know, yellow-headed blackbirds, trumpeter swans, all these migrating birds coming into our area. But then August hit, and the birding just died, and we were stuck at about 280 species. And I thought, oh man, I don't know if we can get to 350. But you guys have heard that phrase, desperate times call for what? Oh, that's not how I learned it. I learned it, desperate times call for credit cards, right? Right? So I booked us one more trip, this time out to California. And we happened to go during something called the Monterey Bay Birding Festival. So we took our first pelagic ocean cruise to look for seabirds. We signed up for an all-day field trip that went from the coast into the inland areas where we saw all of these California specialties like Lawrence's goldfinches and wren tits and yellow-billed magpies, which only live in a little area of central California. And we came back from that trip. Oh, and I should say our last day there, we saw a bird that I had always dreamed of seeing in the wild. Can anyone guess what it might have been? condor, California condors. That's right. Something I never thought I would see because their population got down to about 25, 26 birds. And in fact, they wouldn't be around today if scientists hadn't scooped them all up and began an intensive captive breeding program. But now there are about 500 of these birds, and many of them are flying wild again. So this was a really special way to kind of wrap up the trip. We came back from California in late September with 200 or 320 species, and we birded hard the rest of the year. We saw things like American pipits. And on our last day of the year, Braden, Nick, and I had the most incredible experience with a northern pygmy owl out at Maclay Flat here. It landed in a tree about 15 feet from us, and we just all sank down in the snow and stared at each other for about 15 minutes. So, did we make 350? No, we didn't. We ended up with about 337. But of course, the number didn't matter at all, right? It's the adventures we had and also how much we learned about birding in this year. In fact, it was like a crash college course in birding doing this big year. And as you can imagine, it stimulated a lot of book ideas. I wrote my first adult book that I'd ever written, a book called Warblers and Woodpeckers, A Father-Son Big Year of Birding. And it gave me all kinds of other ideas too. And right now I'd kind of like to switch gears and focus on two of the books that arose directly or indirectly from this big year that we did. The first is a book called Waiting for a Warbler. And I had the idea for this book after we visited High Island in Texas, seeing all of these amazing warblers around. I thought, do people really understand what these birds go through to get back and forth from their winter to their breeding areas every year? And here in Montana, I mean, we're lucky if we might see 8 or 10 species of warblers in a year if you bird pretty hard. But in the east, there's like 40, 45 species that you can see, including the black and white warbler here, chestnut-sided warbler, black-throated blue warblers, northern parulas, which are warblers as well. And it's not just warblers, there are incredible other songbirds like rose-breasted grosbeaks and stuff that come through there too. But I thought for this book, I really wanted to focus on one of my favorite warblers, which is called a cerulean warbler. Now, these birds are highly threatened, probably mostly because of habitat loss. But you can see what they do is similar to all the other warblers. They spend their winters down in Latin America. Many of the cerulean warblers, in fact, live in coffee plantations down there, shade-grown coffee plantations. And then they start making their way up Central America. And then the Yucatan here is a staging area for a lot of these birds. And when they're all ready to do it, they fly directly nonstop from there to High Island, which is right there. So I thought, I want to write a book about what these warblers go through. So I had this idea, Raining Down Warblers, that would talk about, the harrowing journey across the Gulf Coast, the different places that they need to survive. This is where they breed, actually, up here. And I sent it to my editor, and he liked it, but he said, but why not work in another story of people who are waiting for these warblers on the other end? And I thought, why didn't I think of that? Because this is the kind of thing that I and my family have been doing for years. In fact, when we moved into our new house up in the Rattlesnake, the first thing I did was start planting native plants all around the house. I learned that the deer loved my native plants. In fact, they probably ate or tore out 3/4 of them. But through trial and error, I was able to get some plants to grow, and often by protecting them behind barriers here. And today, this is kind of a little habitat mecca for animals. I think this year alone, we got at least 8 or 10 species of butterflies to our garden. We get lots of other insects, and we get tons of birds. In fact, since we moved in, my son and I have counted 67 species of birds just in our yard. And a lot of them are attracted to these native plants that we planted there. So I decided to work to create two parallel stories. And I'll just read a little bit of them so you can kind of see how it lays out. So, do you think any birds will nest here this year? Nora asked, her breath misting in the crisp spring air. If they find what they're looking for, Owen answers. I hope they do, Nora says, especially a sky bluebird. Owen laughs. You mean a cerulean warbler? Yeah, that one. They're really rare. We only saw one of them last year, and it was just passing through. I know, but maybe it will stay longer this year. Thousands of miles to the south, the tropical forests begin to stir. From Peru and Colombia, all the way through Panama, Costa Rica, and southern Mexico, thousands of birds are getting ready. Millions of birds. We've done a good job here, Dad says, joining Owen and Nora. We left our big old oaks and hickories on the property, and we also put in other native plants, adds Owen. Dad smiles. Thanks to you. Improving the yard was Owen's idea. He read how most people fill their yards with exotic plants, those that come from other places and provide little food for native insects and birds. Owen and his family have worked hard to plant native trees and shrubs instead. Their efforts have begun to pay off. We saw more birds and butterflies last year than we ever did before, Dad says. Owen reaches out and touches the tender tip of a dogwood branch. I'll bet this year will be even better. By early March, the birds are on the move, beginning the journey to their northern breeding grounds. Some hug the coastline along Central America and Mexico. Others follow the mountain ranges. One evening in early April, as the sun flashes its last rays over the misty slopes in Mexico, an especially large flock of birds sets off directly north. Their journey will be the most dangerous of all. And so it goes like that, back and forth, and you learn about the birds that are resident in the east, and then you start learning about the migratory birds that come in. But you also learn about many of the dangers that these birds face during their migration. Storms are especially a big hazard for them. If a storm hits at the wrong time, the winds will keep these birds from ever reaching their destinations, and many of them will die. But usually it works out. And with this book, I just followed both the birds and the family that's waiting for these birds to arrive. And in the back of it, I have a section about how all of us can help make our yards much birdier and more insect friendly. And in fact, this week when I was thinking about this talk, I decided to put together a handout that I hope each of you will take. It gives some basic guidelines for how to start turning some of that sterile wasteland of grass that you have in your yard into native habitat, and also some of the list of plants that I've been especially successful with in my yard, and also where to get them. So please, everyone, take one of those when they leave, along with any of the other things that are up here too. So that was the first book that came out of this big year, Waiting for a Warbler. They don't have it outside, by the way, but they can order it for you, or you can order it from any bookstore if you're interested. The second book actually came about from our big year more indirectly. We were so excited about our trip to Texas during our big year that Braden and I returned to Texas 2 years later. This year, though, we decided not to go back to High Island, but to bird from Brownsville up along the Rio Grande Valley up to Laredo. And this, again, is just an incredible area for birding. We were seeing things that we'd never seen anywhere else, stopping in one park or birding area after another. And most of these places were within a rock's throw of the Rio Grande River. And being along the river here did a couple of things for me. One, it gave me a much greater appreciation how this cross-border area is really its own culture and how rich the back and forth has been between the U.S. and Mexico side of the river here. This is a bridge in Laredo, and you can, if you look closely, you see people are backed up all the way across the bridge, waiting to come into the U.S. for the day to work or to visit family and that sort of thing. In fact, we wanted to experience this for ourselves, so one day we walked into Mexico from the Texas side. And this sign really struck me. In fact, the difference between attitudes on each side of the border. To get into Mexico, we put a quarter in a turnstile. That was it. We didn't have to show our passport, nothing. We just walked in, and I love this sign they had welcoming us too. But look back here. See this row of cars? They're coming the other direction. And it took us about an hour, and that was a good day, getting back into the U.S. And so much more suspicious. But we had a great time over in Mexico. We ate lunch. Braden got a haircut. We did some birding while we were there, and people were wonderful to us while we were there. So the other thing that happened while I was down there is we noticed these huge barriers along the border. I forget how tall these are. They're at least like 12 or 14 feet, maybe even taller. And so I'm looking at these, I'm thinking, okay, that's the border fence. How do animals get back and forth? Well, it's clear they don't, right? You look at this thing, every once in a while there's a little hole like this, maybe every couple hundred yards, but can animals find that? Most of them can't. And so I started worrying about these animals and thinking, why is nobody talking about this? Because while the border is a totally artificial construct, what's not artificial are the ecosystems that cross the border. Look, there's at least 7 or 8 major ecosystems that we share with Mexico. And as ex-President Trump started talking and pushing for this border wall, I worried about it even more because wildlife never came up in any of these conversations. So I decided I wanted to write a book to help raise awareness of this issue because no one was talking about it. So I came up with a book called Border Crossings. And instead of explaining it to you, I will just read it to you now. On a moonless night, padded paws silently step across the pebbled ground. They make their way past thorn trees, through brush, and around a muddy marsh. They halt, alert and tense. Then they continue walking. The paws belong to a young ocelot, one of the rarest animals in the United States. It is springtime and the beautifully spotted male cat is heading south toward Mexico, looking for a mate in a territory he can call his own. The ocelot's movements are cloaked by thick brush and the cover of darkness, but suddenly he encounters something unexpected, something frightening. Where protective plants once stood, an ugly scar now stretches. Running in both directions, as far as the ocelot can see, looms a wall. The ocelot has encountered fences and ditches before, but nothing like this. Cautiously, he creeps across the wide expanse and up to the tall, strange structure. He sniffs at the gleaming metal. The wall smells alien, out of place. The ocelot places a paw on the structure. He is a good climber, but his claws slide uselessly on the wall's metal surface. He tries to squeeze through the wall, but the gaps are too narrow. He is searching for a way around the wall or under it when harsh headlights approach, accompanied by a loud roaring sound. The ocelot sprints away back into the brush. He will not find a mate or territory this year, maybe not any year. The ocelot has been turned back by the border wall. The border is a line created to separate two great nations, the United States and Mexico. For the ocelot and other animals, however, these aren't separate lands. They are connected by some of the richest habitats in North America. The border stretches almost 2,000 miles from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico, runs through chaparral and desert, mountain and canyon. It cuts through forest, grassland, and brushlands that are home to many plants and animals found nowhere else on Earth. Night and day, countless animals cross and recross the border. In the Sonoran Desert, 1,000 miles from the male ocelot, a group of javelinas forages for juicy leaves and fruits. Rare Sonoran pronghorns stop for a drink at a precious watering hole. Warblers and other songbirds fill up on insects and fruits to fuel their migrations north. Come nightfall, the female ocelot also is on the move. She follows canyons and arroyos north through the dark desert. In places, saguaro cactuses tower over her. Prickly cholla and barrel cactuses crouch in between. The cat hears the stalks of willowy ocotillo plants scratching against one another in the breeze. She smells the sweet scent of their blood-red blooms. Like the male ocelot, the female ocelot reaches the United States-Mexico border. Here she finds no barrier to stop her. The desert stretches without a break, connecting to the two countries, not dividing them. The ocelot can continue north, searching for a fresh territory to live in, one with food, water, maybe even another ocelot. The animals and plants of the border have inhabited and passed through this region for thousands of years. They adapted to changing climates. They witnessed the arrival of the earliest humans. They moved freely back and forth across the land long before there were countries, long before there was a thing called the border. But today, the border wall threatens these animals' survival. Some can fly over the wall or find their way through. Many, though, are stopped from finding the food or water they need. Others cannot find mates. Some cannot reach their spring and summer breeding grounds. Even a low-flying ferruginous pygmy owl turns back at the wall and the barren earth surrounding it. Fortunately, the wall is not everywhere. Not yet. In places, animals still move freely about this spectacular region. They cross the made-up line that humans have created. For them, the border is not something that separates, it is something that connects. For them, the border is quite simply home. And so that is the book, Border Crossings. And I have to tell you, it's one of the hardest books I've ever written, and for a couple of different reasons. One is while I was researching it, it was very difficult to even get information about a lot of the areas and the animals that are down there. It's surprising how little science has been done on a lot of the animals that are down there. But the other thing is that the border wall was being built so rapidly that it was hard to find out what was going on. But it turns out they made much more progress than I had hoped or expected. In fact, when Braden and I went back to Arizona, we were struck by the changes that we witnessed after 6 years. This area, of course, has fabulous bird life, including painted red starts and elegant trogons that live only in this part of the United States. But when we were there our first time, this is what the border looked like, right? You could see there might have been a barbed wire fence down here somewhere, but it was basically open. When we returned last spring, it looked like this. Everywhere we looked was this non-stop wall stretching hundreds of miles. It divided the ecosystems. It divided communities that had historically been closely connected. The only places that were left without the wall were in the steepest parts of this, only about 18 miles of the whole Arizona border. And I believe that has been completed now too. Fortunately, some people are talking now about how to restore some passageways for the wildlife, but it just strikes me how again and again we act with so little thought into the big picture of our actions. And if anything, I hope that border crossings will help some people reflect on this and question some of these simplistic solutions like, oh, well, let's build a wall, you know. Yeah, that'll solve all our problems. Well, it obviously has not. And it's made some problems much worse. And so, yeah, so that was border crossings. I've also been writing some other books. Beaver and Otter Get Along, sort of, which is kind of a whimsical tale about a beaver who sets up shop in a new valley. And once he's got it in good shape, who shows up? But a family of otters, and they're a big nuisance to the beaver. But they have to kind of tolerate each other. And so it's a good story about how to get along between neighbors. I've also wrote a book called Little Killers, The Ferocious Lives of Puny Predators. I've always been struck about how big predators like tigers and great white sharks get all the press. But the vast majority of predators are little tiny critters that are every bit as interesting as these big charismatic animals that we focus on. So that book came out last year. At the end of next year, I've got a book I'm really excited about kind of one-of-a-kind animals. And these are animals that do not have close relatives. Most animals do have close relatives. Like if you take a robin, it's got dozens of other birds that are closely related to it. But there are some animals that either through just chance or evolution or geography are very, very different from anything else, like the secretary bird in Africa. There's nothing else like this on the planet, and yet they're fascinating birds. They kick their prey to death and then eat them. The platypus is a more famous example. There's nothing else like a platypus in the world. So even echidnas, which are the only other mammals that lay eggs, are very, very different from these guys. So that book's coming out. And so you can see how just my passion in animals has led to all kinds of ideas. I continue to do a lot of school visits too. That's a big part of my career. I probably visited 700 schools in my career. But now I'm having even more fun because often when a school invites me now, I don't just give lectures, they invite me to take kids out birding. And so imagine that, getting paid to take kids out to look at birds. I mean, how good is that? So I've been doing that a lot, especially around Missoula the last few years. And really, it's a hoot to do that and show these kids some of the cool animals at their doorstep. Meanwhile, my son Braden birding has taken him on quite the journey as well. For his Eagle Scout project, for instance, he built this exclosure out at the Five Valleys Land Trust site at Rock Creek. All of this grass here is invasive brome, and so they've been wrestling with how to restore the habitat there. And as an experiment, Braden put up this deer exclosure here and planted it with native plants. And you can see some of these are starting to poke up above the grass. So hopefully in 20 years, this will be a neat little animal habitat for critters. He's also helped me lead field trips out into the Bern Forest and other places. He's been bird banding with scientists down at MPG Ranch, and his passion for birds even got him a college scholarship at the University of Maine. And so I have no doubt he's going to be an ornithologist and is heading to Costa Rica, in fact, this coming year for a semester abroad. He has unfortunately also caught the writing bug a little bit. We co-write a blog called fathersonbirding.com that you can check out to learn more about our latest adventures. And you can contact me either through my email, sbcollardii@gmail, or through my website, sneedbcollardthird.com, or through fathersonbirding.com. Or even easier, you can just pick up one of these flyers. And I think, oh, and that has my email address on it as well. But I just wanted to thank you for being here and supporting the Festival of the Book. Right now, I've got some time to answer some questions if anybody has any questions about anything I talked about today. Anyone? Yes.
I'm going to reveal how much I don't know about birds.
Oh, sure.
So when the migration impulse, or whatever it is, starts, does it start en masse, or does it start a few at a time, or?
Both, kind of. Each species has its own timing, and in fact, there's a program called eBird where you can just look up, and it shows you bar charts of when the peak presence of those birds is in any given area. And so usually it seems to be about a 2-week window per species. But a lot of those overlap. So like if you go to High Island at the beginning of April, you're going to hit, 40 or 50 migrating species windows. And in Montana, you can also see when they show up. Right now, spring migration is much more famous, but fall migration is a big deal too. And those tend to be strung out a little more. But right now in Missoula, we're getting all kinds of migrating birds that are heading south again too. And one of the big things to look for here are shorebirds. And you never think of Montana as being a place for shorebirds, but we have about a dozen species that nest in Montana. They fly up to the grasslands near Malta and Great Falls, and they nest there. And now they're heading back from Alaska and Canada. And so my one complaint with western Montana is there's not very many good shorebird habitats, shallow lake shores where they can poke around for mud. But if you go to the other side of the divide, there's a lot more. So that's kind of the story on that. Anyone else? Yeah.
Do you have any involvement with Irish and the osprey cams in Missoula?
No, other than having interviewed Eric Green, who got a lot of that going. I've written some articles about his work. In addition to the children's books, I'm also, since COVID began, I've been writing a lot of magazine articles for like Montana Outdoors and Big Sky Journal and Birdwatchers Digest, things like that. So yeah, no, I've kind of stayed out of the osprey camp because it looked like it was pretty full already. There are a lot of osprey lovers in the world. Anyone else? Yeah.
Are you up on what the latest is with kestrels? The population just seems to be.
Is it? Okay. No, I'm not up on that. But I know that that insecticides are a huge problem. There's one class, and I forget what they're called. Do you remember what? There's one class. Yeah, the neocotinant. And they believe this is harming many, many species because they're spraying it a lot of times when they don't even need to. But a big problem is they're coating corn kernels with this insecticide, which is just madness and then they throw them out in the field and birds eat these. And one corn kernel, coated corn kernel, is enough to kill a lot of these birds. And so it's killing the birds directly, but it's also killing all the insects they need to eat. And since kestrels eat a lot of insects, I'm betting there's a link there. But yeah, Fortunately, I'm not seeing this a whole lot in Montana, but boy, the Midwest and the East, the birds are just getting hammered by this. So, yeah. Anyone else?
What was the chemical that you mentioned?
The neocontinents, they're made from nicotine, and they're terrible for bees.
Yeah, the bumblebees. Look up the American Birding Conservancy. American Bird Conservancy. They're very active about this issue, and they're a great group to support, and they will send you updates on when to write letters and stuff like that. But some states have banned these chemicals already, but it needs to be a nationwide ban except for very specific uses, so. Anyone, did you have a question? Yeah.
What recommendations, are there any recommendations to help the animals get over these fences? Is there any ideas?
Well, there are ideas to create some openings in the fence, but of course, those have to be monitored very closely because any opening big enough for an animal, a person can also get through. And so I'm not sure what they're thinking that way, but I believe that just as many people are getting through with the wall in place as did beforehand. And so I would like to see them start removing sections of the wall. I doubt that'll ever happen, but you can dream, right? So, I mean, the first time we went down there and we were birding along the border, there were Border Patrol agents, every half mile, and they were I thought they were probably doing a fine job with what they were supposed to do, Back when I was birding in downtown Laredo, we got out, it was kind of this no man's land on the U.S. side, but Braden and I parked, got out and we're birding, and a Border Patrol car came up, and I thought, uh-oh, we're in trouble now. And he rolled down the window and he said, "You looking for birds?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, there's a really good place about a mile down the river here that you should check out." And we had a really nice conversation. And I talked to him. I said, "Well, do many people cross right here?" And he said, "Yeah, they try. There was a raft about an hour ago that had 3 people, and we scooped them up, But I don't know. It just, yeah, it's so politicized that the best solution probably is never going to happen, But hopefully we can work toward improving it for animals at least, But anyone else? Yeah. Sure. Both, actually. Most of my books have been published by other publishers. But about 10 years ago, I started my own company called Bucking Horse Books, which is distributed by Mountain Press, who also supports the festival in big ways. And so I published about 10 books through them. It was kind of an experiment. It's a really difficult thing to do because, yeah, you can, even if you create a beautiful, well-written book, how are you going to market it, especially if you're a one-person show. And so some of the books did quite well, like Firebirds got a lot of attention. That was one of mine. I wrote one about climate change called Hopping Ahead of Climate Change that did very well. But I've since stopped publishing children's books, though I am doing an adult book. It'll be my first book I've self-published in quite a while. And this last spring, I took my daughter to Japan for 3 weeks. And I realized that a lot of the information in these guidebooks is confusing and incorrect. And so I decided to just write a step-by-step guide for how to take a trip to Japan. And so I'm working on that right now, and that's going to come out, I hope, in February. So it's not a sightseeing guide. It's a how do you get the train from the airport to your hotel, and how to do this and how to do that. So that's an experiment too. We'll see what happens with that. So anyone else? No? Okay, well, I'll be hanging around for at least 15 minutes or so to sign some books and answer any questions. Thanks for showing up today.